good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this RSA event with Chris Bryant, talking about his new book, Code of Conduct. He'll be doing a signing afterwards. They've even got one or two of my books as well, so I hope you don't mind if I join you.
It's outrageous.
Now, the last time I was in this room was many years ago on a panel with the Labour MP Stephen Pound. He's got a great sense of humour, but he misheard something I said, and on this stage called me a CUNT. My aim is not to provoke Chris to do the same during the course of the next hour. Now, as you know, because you're here, and so many of you wanted to come, there's an overspill room, and people are watching online. Hello to everyone who is. And you'll be able to watch it again on YouTube. We're here to talk about parliamentary reform, which I think is a subject that, for once, is on the lips of ordinary voters. And I know that because I host a phone-in programme every night. And I think the view that ordinary voters have of politicians as a species now, it's never been particularly positive, but I think it's probably lower than it's ever been. And I think Chris, in this book, articulates a lot of the reasons for that, and then comes up with some solutions. Because I think the temptation when you write a book like this is you diagnose all of the problems, which are actually quite easy to diagnose, but the challenge is, well, okay, what do you do about it? Do you have a big bang parliamentary reform bill to go through Parliament, or do you do it incrementally? And if you do it incrementally, will anyone notice? So those are the subjects that we're going to address over the next hour. We'll have plenty of time for questions. We're going to take questions from people watching online as well. So do prepare those. But I would like questions, not speeches. But in terms of speeches, let me introduce our star guest this afternoon, who's now going to tell us all about his book and what he thinks should be done to reform Parliament. Chris Bryant.
Am I doing that there or here? There or here? Oh, there. Oh, right. I thought I was just being interviewed.
Those are my instructions.
Ah. Or just give it to you. A report into their misbehaviour had been published. When I handed it in, we'd got to 20. When we finished the proofs, we'd got to 22, and it's now at 25. Well, it will be at 25 tonight when we probably almost certainly carry the motion on Peter Bone, suspending him for 6 weeks, which is likely to lead to a by-election. And part of that is for a good reason, which is that there's lots of stuff that we used to... is what it looks like. In which case I don't need that, do I? So when I was first elected in 2001, we used to sweep an awful lot of things under the Pugin carpet. Very elegantly. It was all dealt with very quietly by the whips in the background, including things that today we would simply not countenance. So I remember early days, there were several male MPs who weren't out as gay, and they seemed to think that I was fair game and would touch me up in the division lobbies. None of that. I never complained at the time because that's not the kind of thing you did. Today I would. We have a proper system for dealing with that. And I remember very clearly a young female Labour MP being in the division lobby and being hugged clearly inappropriately by an older, actually fairly drunk MP, former cabinet minister. And I could see on her face how hateful she thought that moment was. But again, she never complained. She just made sure that she was never anywhere near him again in the division lobby. So in one sense, we've done some good things over these last 20 years. We've changed some things. We have got a proper system for dealing with sexual harassment and bullying, and that's why quite a few MPs have gone. That is not a partisan point. There have been Labour MPs like Christian Matheson, who've resigned. In fact, he after the report had been produced, or Mike Hill, who resigned before the report was produced, and today we've got the Peter Bone case. But my central thesis is actually the biggest problem that we've got is what I call the winner takes it all, to quote ABBA, problem in our system. Once you become Prime Minister in our system, as long as you have a majority in the House of Commons, even though that is very, very rarely tested, you get to do anything you want, broadly speaking. You decide when Parliament sits, how long it sits for each day, what amendments can be voted on, when we go on recess, when we go on holiday, when Parliament is prorogued, so no committees can keep on meeting, when there's a general election, how many people get appointed to the House of Lords, every single penny of expenditure. We don't actually have a budget in our system, like in the United States of America or in your local council. We have a budget statement, which is the government's declared aims and intentions. And most of all of its expenditure is simply wound up in a single vote, where if you vote against, and you only have a choice of voting for or against, if you vote against, no expenditure is spent across the whole of the economy. So we have a system which really is winner takes it all. And I think this is problematic, especially once a government has been in place for quite a while, because people get so used to being government ministers and being in charge and making all the decisions about everything, that they start to stretch the rules. So, for instance, I think we should still be much, much angrier, even about what I'm about to say, than about all the things, all the 25 MPs who've been suspended. We should be angrier about the way money isn't now allocated by government ministers directly on the basis of discretionary funds, where the minister knows the name of the MP who has had to support the application through the Towns Fund or the Levelling Up Fund. Leave aside the fact that it's a tiny amount of money that's being distributed, but it's made to look like it's a lot of money, even though local authority budgets have been cut by something like between 30 and 40% since 2010 in real terms. It's the fact that a minister decides where the money goes. So you would think, for instance, that all the Towns Fund money, which is meant to be part of levelling up, all the money would go to the poorest towns in Britain. But it hasn't. One of them was, I think, the 538th poorest town. In other words, the 100, I'm going to get my maths wrong now. Anyway, but just over 100th richest town in England. So that's the kind of thing that happens. And then the other thing that happens is that ministers get so used to being in charge of the timetable in Parliament that they deliberately manipulate it so that there's not enough time to debate things properly in the House of Commons. And the classic instance of this year was the National Security Bill. Very important piece of legislation. Some of us have been calling for it for a long time. A bit was added at a late stage by the government. Really important thing to introduce a system of national registration of foreign agents. Again, something they've had in the United States of America for a long time. The Foreign Affairs Committee, on which I sat, has been calling for this for a long time. All good stuff, except that the amendments that the government was tabling were longer than the bill itself. So you would think that you would have, at least a full day to debate them, or maybe even 2 days. In the House of Lords, I think they had 5 days to debate them. We had 2 hours, because the government decided that the votes had to be at 7 o'clock, and before 7 o'clock, they inserted 3 statements by government ministers on fairly things that nobody had asked for a statement on, basically just to take up time so that you couldn't have a full debate on the National Security Bill. Now, you see, in the House of Lords, the reason it's different in the House of Lords is that the House of Lords is in charge of its own timetable and its own agenda. It can decide, and the government can't stop it, to have several days to go through everything line by line. Whereas in the House of Commons, it's all decided basically by the Prime Minister and by the Leader of the House. I think the simplest thing that we could do to change it is to say that we should take back control, to use somebody's phrase, we should take back control from the executive for Parliament. A simple thing. There are some elements of the way that we do politics in our system, which of course are preposterously outdated as well, and I think could do with a little bit of reform. You will, well, I don't know, if you read most novels about politics, they will always say, and then the politician resigned, the MP resigned. And I always want to shout at the novelist, you can't resign as an MP, because there's a motion from the 16th century which says no member is allowed to resign. The way you stop being an MP is because there was another motion at the end of the 17th century which said any member who receives an office of profit under the Crown is automatically excluded from the House. The office of profit an office of profit under the Crown used to include being a government minister. So if you became a government minister more than 6 months after a general election, you had to fight a by-election. We abolished that in 1926. But the kind of appendix that is left from this is the Chiltern Hundreds or the Manor of Norstead. So you will know Nadine Dorries, wonderful woman. Ian told me earlier that her TV programme is really good. And he texted her to tell her that it's really good. I haven't watched it myself. But you're getting a retaliatory microphone. It doesn't work. Good. Anyway, you'll get a moment. But so Nadine Dorries, she said that she was going to resign with immediate effect, if you may recall. I think it took us 74 days to put immediate... But she is a notorious publisher of fiction, I suppose. So... But the key point for me is, actually, you should have a simple system of resigning. You should just write to the Speaker and resign. It seemed bizarre in the extreme to me, I'll come on to Owen Paterson, but that when Owen Paterson was being thrown out of Parliament for blatant corruption, we had to give him an office of profit under the Crown. So he was made the Crown Steward and Bailiff of the, I can't remember which he got, whether it was the Manor of Norstead or the Chiltern Hundreds. And even more bizarrely is Gerry Adams. Gerry Adams, of course, never turned up, but Gerry Adams wanted to resign as an MP, so he wrote to George Osborne, who was then the Chancellor, to say, I'm resigning, ta-ra, broadly speaking. And George Osborne said, great, I'm appointing you as the Crown Steward and Bailiff of the Manor of Norstead. And he said, but I'm a Republican, I don't want to be a Crown anything. And George Osborne said, well, tough you are. So now you can take your pick on this. You can either go, oh, isn't it nice that we have these quaint little things in the British Constitution? Or you could just go, you know what, this is now long past its use by date. Let's just be sensible and do things properly. The one other thing that I think needs radical reform is... Oh, no, I should just do Owen Paterson, shouldn't I? So where this book started from, for me, when I was writing it, was the Owen Paterson saga. You may recall that Owen Paterson was former Northern Ireland minister. He had been paid tens of thousands of pounds by 2 different food companies, and he was effectively lobbying round Whitehall with ministers and officials to get contracts or a better deal or recognition for those companies from government. And the commissioner launched an inquiry into him. The Parliamentary Commission for Standards, they sent a report through to me, to my committee, to the Standards Committee, and we found him guilty of what we called an egregious instance of paid lobbying. Paid lobbying is something that has been illegal since 1695 under our system, since the Orphans Bill was helped through Parliament by the then Speaker for a consideration of 1,000 guineas. Now, the Orphans Bill, I know you're thinking, well, that sounds really nice, the Orphans Bill. They're doing something nice for orphans. Quite the reverse. This was actually the City of London wanted the bill to go through because they wanted to take all the money from the orphans' charities and spend it on the City of London instead. So that was 1695. That rule's been there all the way up until now. We said that Owen Paterson should be suspended from the House for 30 days. Now, I presumed that the leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, because he's a man of constitutional integrity and all that, and you know, and is always going on about history, he would honour the tradition, which is that the government simply tables the motion and the motion pretty much goes through as is. The only time that a motion from a Committee of Standards or Privileges report had been changed was in 1954 when the committee had recommended, 1948, when the committee had recommended that a member be suspended for 6 months, and Winston Churchill said that's not enough, and so he was just chucked out. So it had only gone in that direction. But what happened on this occasion was that Owen Paterson persuaded all his friends in the Conservative Party, including Boris Johnson and Andrea Leadsom and Jacob Rees-Mogg, to allow an amendment to be tabled, which basically tore up the system, got rid of the Standards Committee, put a new Conservative chair in charge of a new committee, which would re-decide the whole case from the beginning. And they said that they'd done this on a cross-party basis, even though they hadn't talked to anybody in any of the other political parties at all. And Jacob Rees-Mogg gave the most extraordinary speech, really. I mean, he quotes Portia. He actually does. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth gentle, all of that stuff. It was just sententious guff, but it did the trick. He won the vote, 250 to 232, and that's what really depresses me, that there are still 250, well, slightly fewer now, 245 MPs in Parliament who voted to tear up the rule book to protect a named individual. That's what happens in Putin's Russia, not what happens in a proper democracy such as ours. Two final things then, and then Ian's going to quiz me. The first is, I think we need to do more about the Ministerial Code. The Ministerial Code, as it's written at the moment, isn't worth the paper it's theoretically written on. I asked, one of the lines in the code, in the Ministerial Code says, all announcements of government policy should be made to the House of Commons first. I asked Rishi Sunak whether he supported the Ministerial Code, because he's got his name on the bottom. He said, yes, completely. And I said, I pointed this bit out to him, and he said, yes, I support that. And then I said, so why did you announce the NHS work plan, not to Parliament, but in Downing Street? Well, I asked Sir Laurie Magnus, who's the independent advisor on ministers' interests, whether he would ever investigate a breach of the code of conduct, of the Ministerial Code, such as that. And he said, well, yes, in theory, which I guess means not in practice. So that's one of the things that I would dearly love us to change. And then, very final point, I think if there's one thing that winds voters up more than anything, and referring to what Ian said earlier about the reputation of MPs at the moment is terrible, it is MPs lying. Now, don't get me wrong, I have sometimes said things inaccurately. Lots of MPs do all the time. You might say million when you mean billion, or billion when you mean million. You might have simply read a fact incorrectly and got it into the record, or sometimes if you're not reading out a speech word for word, you might misspeak or whatever. Absolutely fine. Nobody minds about that. That is a genuinely inadvertent error. And sometimes those can be quite big things, and you should correct the record when you can. Up until yesterday, the only people who can formally correct the record are government ministers. But interestingly, and most ministers do it all the time. You have about 250 instances of ministers correcting the record every year. And it's really clever because it means that the original in Hansard is noted as being corrected on such and such a date. So the original doesn't stand as a mistake. It's a really important part of it. As of last night, that will be available to all backbenchers as well, which I think is a really good thing. I've been arguing for it for quite a long time, so that's good. But sometimes ministers matter more because we make decisions on the basis of what they tell us. Sometimes ministers refuse to correct the record. Boris Johnson corrected the record once. It was when he had been asked by Keir Starmer whether Roman Abramovich had been sanctioned as a Russian oligarch over the invasion of Ukraine. And Boris Johnson said, yes, he had. And I asked, because I was pretty certain that he hadn't, again, are you sure that yes, he has? And the next day, Boris Johnson corrected the record to say, no, he hasn't. Maybe I'm cynical, but I suspect that Roman Abramovich might have been in touch, or his lawyers in advance. But that was the biggest problem about Boris Johnson, that he never properly corrected the record, it seemed to me. Now, I have a simple solution to this, which is that if a minister is written to by the Office of National Statistics to say, sorry, mate, what you're saying is simply not true, and you must stop using that, because it's not a fact, it's the opposite of a fact, then the minister must correct the record within 28 days. And if they fail to do so, they should be suspended from the House of Commons for 5 days. My guess is the first time that that happened will be the last time that that happened, because no minister would want to go through that again. But when I go out knocking doors, I remember during the whole Owen Paterson saga and the Boris Johnson saga, I cannot tell you how many times I go on a television programme where the Conservative MP would say, oh, honestly, none of this matters. Voters don't care about it. It's just tittle-tattle in Parliament. I just hope that the reason this room is full is because every single person in this room does care about this stuff. We need to make sure that whatever happens over the next 12, 18 months, both in a general election and thereafter, improves the standing of politics. Because in the end, all we have is democracy. The only way you can create a better world is through the democratic system. If democracy falls into terrible disrepute, people turn to alternatives, and I don't want any of the alternatives to flourish. Thank you.
Just to complete, is this microphone working? Yes, it is. Marvellous. Just to complete the incomplete Nadine Dorries anecdote, what Chris omitted to mention was that when I sent her a text saying, I really enjoyed your programme, her reply was, are you being sarky? I never know with you. And I said, well, if I didn't enjoy it, I wouldn't have texted you. Anyway.
So you're not going to be sarky now?
Well, we'll see. See how much you provoke me. Do you think there is a glimmer of light for politicians in that if you say to people, what do you think of politicians as a species? They'll say, well, they're lying, thieving, corrupt bastards. Whereas if you say, what do you think of your own MP? Invariably, they'll say something positive. He's helped a neighbour of mine, or he helped me with this particular problem, or she. And I noticed that, I actually did a phone-in on this once, and literally every single caller phoned in to praise their MP for something good that they'd done. So the general public, although they might think of politicians as a species as bad, individually, they can be quite positive about them. Is that a glimmer of light?
I've used that argument as well, and I think it's wearing thin at the moment, is my worry. And it's partly wearing thin because, well, when I first stood to be selected in the Rhondda in 2000, 52 people applied for the seat. You never get 52 people applying for a seat now. And social media has had a really horrible effect. It's, you know, most MPs at some point in the year will go to sleep crying, I would say, because it is so rough. It's so vile. And it's got worse under Elon Musk, is my impression. The death threats are pretty permanent feature of how we have to live with politics now. You know, there weren't smartphones in 2008. Everybody can be vile to a politician in 2 seconds today. And incidentally, you may think I'm going to be paranoid now, but some of this is deliberately amplified by state actors in other countries. They pick on the nasty things that one person has said, and suddenly it feels as if 50 or 100 people have said it, and it's actually still only one. So that's problematic, and that, I think, has had an effect, which is that I'm going to quote a Conservative chief whip. There have been a lot recently, so that's not breaking a confidence. Who said to me, look, there are some people in this Parliament who should never have been selected to fight for a village council or a town council or parish council, let alone rise on the tide of Boris Johnson and get into Parliament. And I think there's an element of that. There are some thugs.
There are, and I think the selection processes for all of the parties need to be looked at.
Yes, it's one of the reasons I've always been in favour of fixed-term parliaments, actually, which is that when you have snap elections, people get selected without due diligence. And yeah. I mean, this is not a partisan point at all, because I look at Jared O'Mara. The Labour Party should never have allowed Jared O'Mara to be a candidate. I mean, he's ended up being in prison, I think, because of accounting stuff. But, you know, he simply wasn't capable of being a member of Parliament. And I think there are others who are in Parliament today. But it's also noticeable, you know, the Peterbone case was first reported to David Cameron in 2015, and then to Theresa May. So sometimes we've still been remarkably reluctant to take these issues as seriously as we should.
I used to be the director of the campaign for fixed-term parliaments. That went well. Well, it did initially.
Yes.
A lot of the things that you've talked about and that you mention in the book, I think some people might think, well, that's just tinkering with the system. I think there is an appetite out there for more of a big bang approach, a real radical reform of our entire democratic system. I mean, they're not talking about the Chiltern Hundreds down the Dog and Duck, are they? They're not even talking about House of Lords reform, I suspect. How do you get the electorate really interested in this sort of thing?
Well, I think the electorate is very interested in standards in public life. That's the key bit. And the thing I get time and time again is about MPs lying. So if you look at polling in the 1940s, 60s, 80s, 90s, it goes kind of 40, 45, 47, 48% think all MPs lie all the time. It's now above 75%. And that is really problematic. So I think we've got to do far more in that space. The code of conduct issues in relation to the ministerial code are a patent nonsense now, and that's reform. But yes, I would do a grand reform bill, which does some of the smaller things I've referred to, but also does some of the big things. And I'm in favour of an elected second chamber. You can have as many rows as you want about exactly what pattern that second chamber should have. But I just think that if somebody wants to tell everybody else how to run their lives, which is basically what being a member of a legislature is, then the least they can do is put themselves up for election.
You're very honest in the book about some of the controversies that you've been involved in, where maybe you haven't covered yourself with glory. Has your own experiences made you a more relevant person to write about these sorts of things? Or because there's no one in Parliament who you could say is a saint, I don't think. Is there anything near to a saint in Parliament?
No.
No.
And I don't want MPs to be saints. I tell the story at the beginning of, I used to be a priest in the Church of England, and I was like 24, which is the youngest you can be ordained, and I was preparing couples for marriage. And our system was you had to come in for 3 sessions with me before I could marry you. And I was thinking, well, A, I haven't quite worked out whether I'm gay or not. B, I'm certainly not very keen on commitment. And what on earth am I going to say about bringing up children and things like that? I know absolutely nothing, but I'm plenty arrogant enough to be able to tell you how you should run your lives. But I remember asking my boss when I was the curate, the vicar, what should I say about bringing up kids? And he said, well, the most important thing is don't load them up with guilt by telling them they've got to be good parents. Just tell them they've got to be good enough parents, because they might actually achieve that. And that's kind of what I think about Parliament. I don't want everybody to be saints. I quite like the fact that, some of them are naughty, but I want them to be good enough. And you're right. If there's anybody in the room who hasn't bought the book, please don't buy it if you think that it's me saying I'm a saint, because I'm very clear about the fact that I am not a saint.
You even quote a Tory MP, was it Mark Fletcher, saying to you, the trouble with you, Chris, is that you're 80% brilliant and 20% crap. Now, I think most of us would settle for that, wouldn't we?
My husband said, I think he got the numbers the wrong way around.
But you are not afraid of controversy.
Yes, I am.
You say some quite near-the-knuckle things sometimes. Do you think that has really held you back in your political career? I think I wrote somewhere once, or said somewhere, that there is a top-class politician struggling to get out of the body of Chris Bryant. Sometimes he makes it, sometimes he doesn't.
I don't think I read that, but I remember the last time we did a panel like this, you said, Chris, you'll never be on the front bench. Nobody will ever appoint you to the front bench. And look, I am the Shadow Minister for Creative Industries and Digital, so you were wrong, Ian Dale. No, look, it's a serious thing, which is that I'm 61 now, and I think part of what I have learned in my 20 years, and if I'm honest, cancer helped with it, is that you do have to accept that part of your performance will always be a bit rubbish, and sometimes you do get things profoundly wrong, and you just need to hold your hands up and say, I've got things wrong. And, and I can be too pompous. I even quote Christopher Chope saying that I'm pompous and I like the sound of my own voice. So
I don't know what's happening with this microphone, but anyway, you do have the ability to change people's opinions. There was a speech not that long ago, I can't remember what it was on, but I know as you were speaking, I could kind of feel the mood of the chamber changing and that you were changing the minds of Tory MPs. That's a real talent to have. Do you recognise that when you're doing it?
I mean, the other reason I wrote the book is because I passionately believe in Parliament. I've written a 2-volume history of Parliament as well, but I want it to be the best version of itself that it can possibly be. I hate it when people just read out questions. Why do you have to read out why can't you remember a question, for heaven's sake? Especially if somebody else has written it for you. And I prefer a debate to be a genuine debate. And sometimes that's a bit irritating because I'm a bit tiggerish, but I think it is an important part of what we try to do. You try to persuade. And of course, sometimes in Parliament, it's just so partisan because we're sitting opposite each other, unlike lots of other chambers in the world. And it's very, you're on your side, I'm on my side, I'm just going to disagree with you. But normally, I'm trying to persuade somebody on the other side to agree with me.
And that's what debate is all about. But have we forgotten the art of debate, do you think?
Well, one thing that has definitely changed is, and this is a difficult balancing act because, now in my constituency, we deal with about, 8,000 cases a year of constituents coming about the drains or whatever, or flooding or whatever it may be. And my staff are really, really assiduous and diligent, and we try to answer everything, preferably within 48 hours if we can, and so on. That is a really important part of the job. But there's a danger that we as MPs get so dragged into that we don't do the other part properly, which is legislating properly for the nation. And Churchill was right. I'm the MP for the Rhondda. Churchill sent the troops into Tonypandy, so I have to be very careful what I say about Churchill. But one thing that he was right about was the order of priority is nation, constituency, party. And sometimes it never feels that the nation gets a look in because most MPs spend their time worrying about what's the 1-minute clip that they're going to put on Facebook later on the day, which proves that they know that Mrs. Jones at number 42 is having trouble with the drains.
And also, if you're an MP in a safe seat, if such a thing exists any longer, you can spend more time on your parliamentary duties, whereas if you're in a marginal seat, you know that every constituency case, even if you know that they've got no cause for their complaint, you've got to treat them very, very carefully and try and help them, even if you know there's nothing you can do. And you effectively become a quasi-social worker, and you deal with all of the complaints that should have gone to the council, but you want to get the credit for them.
Well, I don't think so I slightly disagree about that. I don't think you get any credit in a marginal seat or in a safe seat for making promises to constituents about sorting things out that you actually can't and where you have no real role. I think, in my experience, constituents much prefer you to say, look, I'm really, really sorry, but there is absolutely nothing I can or perhaps even should do in this case because it's a battle that you've already taken through the courts, and I believe in the separation of powers between the courts and politics or whatever. So I think over-promising is another part of what has got politics into disrepute in recent years. There may be slightly more safe Labour seats than Conservative ones at the moment, Ian.
I couldn't disagree with that. Right, should we go to some questions? Who would like to ask the first question? Someone do we have another microphone? Right, we have 2 glamorous assistants, one over there at the back, and then one down here, lady there. Can you say who you are?
Okay, so I'm Simon. I have a question. So you mentioned earlier about this, the too much power going to the executive in terms of controlling the parliamentary timetable. So do you think that our democracy would benefit from having a clearer divide between the executive and the legislative like they have in America?
Well, we lost that vote in 1713. There was a vote basically to separate the executive from the legislature in 1713. There's one thing I really like about our system. Whatever you think of Tony Blair and the Iraq War, Tony Blair had to come to Parliament every single week to defend his decisions. George Bush never once had to defend his decision in Congress or even in a press conference. So I prefer our system, and I like the fact that ministers also have constituencies. I think that roots them, or can root them, and I think that's important. But I still think we would do a better job in the House of Commons if the House of Commons was in charge of its own timetable, rather than just the government.
Right, lady here, and then someone over this side. Oh, this side.
In fact, incidentally, we lost the vote
there.
by 1 in 1713.
I'm Christine Paterson. I'd like to thank you both for being a great force for good in relation to British politics.
Bless you.
Chris, I wanted to ask you, actually I'd like to ask you both this. If you had to pick one country whose political system you think functions well or better than the UK, what would that be?
Well, I want to take bits from lots of different countries. The country I know best politically is Spain. And it's great that they've pulled them. You know, I was partly brought up in Spain under Franco, and it was a dictatorship and so on. And it's great that they've managed to find democracy, but it's a very complicated form of democracy. They've got more devolution, which I like. They have a proportional system. I'm broadly in favour of a proportional system, but the problem with the Spanish system is that the only person who decides who gets elected at the top of the list is the leader of the political party. So the voter doesn't really get much of a say, and you deracinate politicians from a local community. I love being the MP for the Rhondda. I've got my rugby clubs, I've got my choirs, and it's quite an intense relationship. Whereas America normally has rather better checks and balances on the power of the executive, but is in terrible disarray at the moment. All the shenanigans going on in Congress with them unable to elect a speaker, and let alone the fact that you very nearly came to a situation of civil war, it seemed to me, when Trump was refusing to accept the result of a general election.
I kind of agree with that, because I think you look at countries all around the world and there are bits of their systems that you think, well, actually, would that work here? My problem with other countries generally is that they have a proportional system. And although I would be in favour of PR for local elections and the House of Lords, I would not want it for the House of Commons, because I've yet to find a form of PR that would maintain the kind of constituency link that Chris has eloquently described there. The country I know best, Germany, I think there are a lot of things to say for the German political system, but it's having its problems at the moment. So I think that our system, we sometimes underestimate it, and I think there are lots of very good things about our system, but being British, we like to concentrate on all of the bad things. But the bad things can be repaired, as Chris's book shows. Right, gentleman there, and then over here.
You more or less answered the first part of my question, which was whether you prefer constituency or list system. Now, I've lived in countries with list systems. I very much prefer constituency system. That link locally is vital. And one of the biggest mistakes we made was to put our MEPs on a list system. So as a European Parliament, we're invisible to their constituents, to the locality. Could never get any coverage as a result. However, there are different ways of electing your constituency member. Now, where we live now, we used to have a very good...
Could we have a question, please?
Yeah, I could. Which system would you prefer to have for electing your constituency member? The current system, where you end up with so-called safe seats, or something like we had when we lived in Northern Ireland, a transferable vote system, or any other PR system, but keeping the local constituency?
Well, I'm the MP for the Rhondda, which is the only seat that has been Labour since 1885 now. And in one sense, that feels safe. However, Plaid Cymru won it twice in the Senate elections and the Assembly elections. What we have in Wales is an additional member system, so we have 40 constituencies and 20 list. Now, I know lots of my colleagues rant and rave about the list members because they say, oh, they just cherry pick and they don't really have the same relationship with the community. But actually, they just provide a challenge to those in their normally safe seats. So I rather like that. I would go for some kind of additional member system so that it feels more proportional. It's clearly bonkers that there's only one Green MP when they get whatever 7, 8, 9% of the vote across the whole of the country. That is bonkers. So that's the way I'd go. But you have to do this, of course. Then you've got to look at the House of Lords and how you're going to elect the House of Lords. And I wouldn't elect it at the same time, and I wouldn't elect it on the same timetable, and so on. I can talk about this for several hours, but not today.
Please don't. Although, I have to say, proportional representation is a subject that seems to be coming up the agenda. I host a sort of any questions type show 3 times a week on LBC, and very often we're now getting questions on PR, which we weren't a couple of years ago.
And the one thing I'd say is, I know, nobody ever stops me in the street or at the rugby club and says, Chris, what do you think about PR or whatever? But what people do care about is the exercise of power. And in the end, the electoral system is about power. Incidentally, the thing that I find most shocking at the moment is a good thing in the British system is that you don't have to be a millionaire to stand for Parliament. It's relatively cheap compared to most other countries in the world, certainly compared to the United States of America. We have a limit on how much political parties can spend nationally in a general election. I think it's 18 million at the moment. The Conservative government wants to put it up to 36 million. I think that's a terrible, terrible mistake, and I think they're doing it for their own electoral advantage. I think you should have rules about how elections are run that, for instance, you should only be able to change them with a 2/3 majority rather than just on the basis of a government.
When I stood for Parliament in 2005, I calculated that it cost me £40,000 as a candidate, and it bankrupted me. I was literally penniless after it. Luckily, I bought a cottage, which I managed to sell for £40,000 more than I paid for it. But that's the only reason I got back on my financial feet, and I said, never again. Anyway.
And it's one of the reasons that lots of women find it very difficult to stand, because finances make it very difficult. But we shouldn't be making it more difficult than it already is, and that's my anxiety about what's going to happen.
Let's take a question from someone who's watching online. Titus Alexander says, please ask if Chris supports a chamber chosen at random as a permanent citizens' assembly where people deliberate and decide issues based on evidence. God help us.
Well, I prefer, excuse me, I prefer evidence-based policy rather than policy seeking evidence. But no, I know everybody derides the idea of a career politician, but actually, politics is about 3 things. It's about what you believe in, your egalitarian principles or however you understand meritocracy or opportunity and so on. It's about how you put that into practice, whether manifesto policies or ideas or speeches or broadcast interviews you do. And thirdly, it's about the alliances that you create. Because as an individual MP, you can never get anything through, you can't. I want to do lots of stuff about acquired brain injury. The only way I can get that done is by persuading Conservatives and Labour people to all be on board. But the first alliance you have to make is to join a political party, because otherwise you're just hundreds and hundreds of rather self-righteous one-man or one-woman bands. And that leads to cacophony. It doesn't lead to an orchestra. I'm mixing my metaphors a lot now. So that's why I believe in a party political system. People in the Rhondda don't vote for me because Chris Bryant is a wonderful person. They vote for me in the main because I'm the Labour candidate, and they want a Labour government because they support the Labour set of policies.
Right, there was somebody over here, and then down here.
though I did attend a citizens' assembly where they decided how much MPs should be paid. And it was quite interesting because they were asked how much they thought they were paid, and they said £300,000. and they said that we should be paid £240,000. So maybe, I don't know.
Is this on?
We're not paid that
It
much,
is on.
by the way.
Right. Michael Balfour. Chris, as an elected second chamber you favour, how can you format that so it doesn't repeat the problem of the first chamber, which is short-termism engendered by an election on the horizon rather than long-term policies for the strategic long-term benefit of the country?
Well, I mean, it is inevitable that in any system, any democratic system where you might have a change of government, that there might be a change of policies in some areas. I think there are some areas now where I would love us to be able to advance a policy that is shared by all the main parties. So, for instance, social care is the classic instance where, frankly, everybody's just got to stop being children about it, grow up, sit down, come together with a plan that is going to stand the test of time and is going to last for 20 years. Tough thing to do, but that's one of the things we're going to have. We, as a body politic, are going to have to do. House of Lords. My plan, if you're interested in it, is that I would elect members by region to a second chamber, a third at successive general elections, and I would have them there for 15 years rather than just for 5, only able to stand once. So it would never have the full democratic legitimacy of a recent election, but at least they would have been put up for election at some point, so they would have an accountability process. That will be my solution. But the other thing you've got to do is you've got to sort out the powers between the second chamber and the first chamber. I don't believe in straightforward abolition of the House of Lords. You've got to have a second chamber so that you can revise legislation properly. But the most important thing is MPs have got to stop being children. We could start with Prime Minister's questions.
Right, Lydia. Oh, it's
Sorry,
man.
wait for the mic.
You have to get the mic just because otherwise you don't get broadcast to the world.
Sorry. I think you've described the 2019 Parliament as the worst in history. Would you also say that the Boris Johnson government was the most corrupt, certainly in recent times? I'm involved with a think tank in Malaysia called the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, and we've been trying to fight corruption in Malaysia. But it's very difficult when you, and I won't make a speech, when you have so much corruption in this country.
Look, what do I think about Boris Johnson? I think he dyes his hair, for a start, which is actually a more important point than you think, because I think it was always an act. And I actually I think he's like a lost child in a strange way. And it was, Alistair Campbell makes this point. He says, any party that gives you Boris Johnson followed by Liz Truss as prime ministers never deserves to be re-elected. And I think there's quite a lot of people that sort of feel that. Look, and one of the things I say in the book is about the phrase one bad apple. Lots of people say, oh, that just means there's just one bad apple, so that's okay. All the other apples are okay. But that's not the point. In Chaucer, it's the one bad apple spoils the barrel, because blight spreads. And I think that that's what we saw during that period. People got used to saying all sorts of nonsense. And I look at... So I've got a lot of Tory MPs who are friends. Very close friends. I've been to my birthday parties and things like that. And I look at them sometimes saying things like Mark Harper saying all that stuff about 15-minute cities, which he knows is nothing but a blatant conspiracy theory in his conference speech. I just thought, you've been blighted. And even decent Tory MPs, I think, got blighted by that whole process. So, yeah, I think it's a problem. And the one thing I'd say to Ian is quite right, that sometimes we, as a nation, one of the things I love about our nation, apart from the fact that we have a church which doesn't really believe anything too strongly, I like that.
Especially God.
Well, I think that's a good thing. I'll never be too fundamentalist in what you believe. But the other thing is, and we do tend to be quite self-critical, and that is a good thing. We don't really like demagogues. We're very distrustful of them. Good. But sometimes we get a bit complacency. We say we're the oldest democracy in the world. We're not actually. Iceland, the Althingi was there before the House of Commons and before Parliament. I thought that whole process we went through when politicians were accusing judges of being enemies of the people and all of that was very dangerous territory. And my anxiety is that, Trump can stay in America is my basic point. I don't want that here.
Another online question from Neil Cole, who says, does Sir Chris think that the media in the UK contribute to falling public trust in politicians and politics to further their own agenda? I'd love to know what this media agenda is, because I've never discovered it.
Well, I mean, some bits of the media clearly do have an agenda. I think the Daily Mirror would like a Labour victory. And I think the Daily Express is still worrying about house prices. And
Princess Diana.
And I was going to say Princess Diana, but I find it very difficult to talk about Diana. Anyway, I helped organise her funeral. That's why it always feels very odd to me talking about it. But so I do think sometimes. I've said this to the BBC many times. I don't know why the BBC and ITV, for that matter, and other broadcasters do review of the newspapers, as if they haven't got any news of their own that they could actually give to us. Why do they have to review the newspapers? The newspapers can review themselves, surely. And I think it sort of steers the political debate towards front pageism. And I think that is a bit problematic. But, look, politicians endlessly moan about the media, and it's like the fishermen moaning about the sea. Just get over it.
Right, two more questions. One there, and here.
Thank you very much. Sir Chris and I share one thing in common, as we both members of the Oxford University Conservative Association, although I went on to serve as a Conservative Member of Parliament and he went the other way.
In more ways than one.
What's your name? Because we can't see you properly.
Keith Best. Yeah. I want to come back to this elephant in the room about electoral reform. I'm an unusual Conservative that I'm a lifelong supporter of electoral reform, and I think it's high time that Westminster followed other legislative assemblies and local authorities in Scotland, and we actually embrace proportional representation. What hasn't been mentioned is one that does keep the link with the constituency member, but it's a multi-member constituency based on a single transferable vote. Yes, you would have several members representing one area, but in most large conurbations that would be one city, like Sheffield, for example, or whatever, but you would still keep that constituency link, and yet you would then overcome this nightmare of where, frankly, people in many constituencies, votes just do not count at all. I live in a very strong Labour constituency. I might as well not turn out and bother to vote in the general election because my vote counts for nothing.
Yes, it does.
Contribute to anything.
That's just a loser's argument.
No, it's not. It counts for nothing. I might as well stay at home. It will not alter the result.
It counts exactly the same as somebody who votes for another party. It's just that your party happens to lose.
My party loses from the very beginning because of the system.
Any road up. He's chairing, by the way. So, Keith, the thing is, when I was a member of the Oxford University Conservative Association, I also had a girlfriend. And
she's here today.
And I'm now slightly homosexual, so, an awful lot of things have changed in the intervening period. Look, I tell you, well, I'm a practicing homosexual, and one day I'll be quite good at it. The serious point, which is that I want a more proportional system, and you can bat them back to and fro. The bit I'm nervous about, Wales is losing 8 seats in the next general election. We go from 40 to 32. My seat will no longer be Rhondda, it will be Rhondda and Ogmore. And there's an irony about that, because if you put Ogmore into gets spell checked, it comes out as Gomorrah. So I think my constituency is going to have a new name. Anyway, but it's going to be very large. I think 75,000 is a lot of people to have the cure of souls for, which is sort of how I see being an MP. But if you make it, I know, but then there are elements of the Americans, but they also have state legislatures and all of that, which are more akin to some of what the functions that we perform in terms of health and education and so on. So my only anxiety is that if you end up with multi-member constituencies, they'll end up being 300,000 people. And it's very, very difficult, genuinely, to represent 300,000 people. That's my problem with multi-member constituencies.
And you'd presumably have, in those big constituencies, Labour voters would go to the Labour MP, Conservative voters would go to the Conservative MP, whereas at the moment, you are representing everybody. And I think that's a really big advantage.
I remember... I helped Glenda Jackson in her campaign in 1992, and the MP at the time, who was not standing again, she beat Oliver Letwin, funnily enough, in 1992, who claimed that he'd invented the poll tax, which wasn't a great thing on his leaflets, but it was good on our leaflets. Incidentally, sorry, I'm going to... So something else has made me cross this last week. When you lose an election, you stay for the victor's speech at the end. Yeah. I thought it was really bad manners. It's just not British just to wander off like that.
And they both did it.
And they both did it. So it was obviously a decision to do it. That's just not on. It's not on. Harumph.
I share your harumphing.
Good.
Right, let's go to a final question here.
So I'm Hattie Simpson. I'm an A-level student. You sort of touched on the fact that politics in the UK particularly has become increasingly partisan and polarised, specifically like the opposing benches, things like that. How do you believe this is actually impacting and holding back UK democracy, and what should change in order to prevent this, or should it change?
When I sit in the chamber of the House of Commons, which I do a lot, I'm a bit freakish, and I look around, I can see MPs with whom I disagree on nearly everything, including about some of this stuff, like Andrea Leadsom. You know, she tabled the motion on Owen Paterson, the amendment, which I thought was completely ill-conceived. But she's done really good work on early years support for kids. I look at Liam Fox. He comes from a completely different tradition from me, but he's done lots of stuff on, more than anybody else in Parliament, on Down syndrome. And I can go on and on and on. And actually, I think we need, this is going to sound terribly biased, but I think we need to discover a bit more of our common humanity in all of that. I'm also conscious now that, you know, the Chamber has got a shield up for David Amess, who was killed, murdered, and for Joe Cox, who was murdered, both in recent years. And I never want to take part in another referendum ever in my life on anything. I think they are fundamentally divisive. Mrs. Thatcher was right when she said that they're the tools of demagogues and dictators. I think there's an enormous job of work to knit the country back together politically. Just sometimes, when the tide turns in a big way in a general election, it does give the country a chance to go, kind of slough off the, you know, all that's gone wrong in the years before. And my big hope is that that's what might happen in a general election in a year's time.
On that bombshell, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring...
Was it a bombshell?
It was a little joke.
Oh, right. It's just you can never tell because you're so sarky.
And it got
so sarky.
It got a little titter, which is all I can ever hope for.
Oh, titter ye not.
Indeed, matron. Right, Chris will be very happy to sign his books in just a few moments' time. My Prime Minister's book I spied there as well, so I'll happily do so too. Thank you for coming. Thanks to everybody who's watched online, and you can watch again on YouTube if you so wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.